Hello and welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Jason Lowe, joined by Andrew Chow, and we are two totally ordinary Catholic guys hoping to share our journeys. Like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we've each encountered Christ in our lives. Join us as we talk about what comes next. Andrew and I have gotten to the age where we're starting to think about the next stage of our lives. Specifically, married life, family life, and bringing up children. In some ways, it's a funny conversation to have because neither of us are even married yet, but it's also an important conversation. How can we do our best to be examples of holiness so that our children can become saints? You can hear what we have to say on that on today's episode. At the time of recording this, I had hoped that I would be able to open the episode with really important news of the Toronto Maple Leafs having advanced to the second round of the playoffs for the first time in like 17 years. And the last couple of games, they just choked and they did not win. And now they're going to game 7. And I'm a huge ball of nerves. And that's all that's on my mind. Are you following this Toronto Maple Leafs Montreal Canadiens playoff series?
No, but I do know that it's the first pro sports game with fans in a long time was in Montreal.
Yeah, that's true.
In Canada. And then also that Ontario said no to having fully vaccinated frontline healthcare workers at Scotiabank Arena for Game 7.
Yes.
So this is my extensive knowledge on this one. And John Tavares was seen on the ice yesterday.
Now you're just showing off. Yeah. It's crazy. I think just today it was that news of like, can we get 2,500 fans into the arena just to help provide that little spark? And they're fully vaccinated. They're all healthcare workers. Let's reward them. But the Ontario government nixed that. So
yeah.
I mean, I've been a Leaf fan since I was a child, and here's hoping that after Monday I will not be sobbing into my pillow every night. But we'll see. And that's outside the scope of this podcast. So it's time to move on. Speaking of children, I think that's something that we wanted to dive into today. Just in terms of...
That's one of your better segues in a while.
Thank you. I actually like kind of came up with it on the fly.
So wonderful.
I feel very proud. But now that we've moved on beyond that, I was reflecting recently in terms of like why we're talking about this and whatever. I was reflecting recently about some good friends of mine, and even just, acquaintances that I've re-met or have stayed close with throughout the years, who I had grown up with in elementary school, in high school. And these people for additional background, I went to a Catholic elementary school and a Catholic high school. And so these are people who went through the Catholic school system, who attended mass, probably on a regular basis with their parents, but also just, within the Catholic school system, we were required to attend. I think it was monthly mass or something that was held at the school. And I was just reflecting on how they've become distanced or lukewarm in their faith.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to dive into why, or at least what happened on that journey.
Yeah.
And so that's what we wanted to do today. Maybe kind of talking about the formation of children, right? What goes into that? What kind of quote unquote should go into that? I guess it's kind of funny that we're talking about this because, as I'm sure our listeners know, Andrew, neither you or I have children, so it's kind of a funny perspective to try to dive into that. But I think it's something that we want to try to provide some insight into.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit more relevant for me than for you because I have thought about this, right? Me getting married in about a month and a half, and just like thinking about like, okay, like when we do have a family, how do we want to approach raising our children, and what's that going to look like? So definitely some thought has gone into this topic for a while for me because same thing as you. I went through the Catholic system over in Vancouver. And there's just varying levels of kind of sticking to the faith afterwards, right? And things that you hear sometimes where it's just it's different, right? And it's something that it's almost a little bit of a sad thing in a sense where just we want something that's so great for them to be something they want as well. and kind of like you said, what happened, and let's chat about that a little bit.
So I think we'll be able to unravel a few of the thoughts that you've had or the discussions that you've had, as you've thought about, what will my future family, what will my future sons and daughters, God willing, look
Yeah,
like or grow up to be in terms of how will they become involved with their faith. But let's kind of dive into, I guess, quote unquote, the issue here, right? Like, why is this the case? What like all these people going through the Catholic school system, or even maybe not necessarily, this isn't a discussion on specifically the Catholic school system or anything, but just having an environment, right, where they are raised in what you could call a Catholic environment, that certainly seems to be what it is. But I think for me, when I was reflecting on this, maybe doing a bit of prep on this episode for once, the couple of things that I kind of was able to guess at or narrow things down to was even though these kids are going through Catholic school, quote unquote, I would say that the curriculum, and I can say this from my own experience, right? I would say that the curriculum isn't necessarily something that is conducive to true, what we might call true Catholic formation.
sure.
And I think what is a big part of that, and you can correct me because I think this might just be an Ontario problem. I'm not sure, but I think what might be a big part of that is that there isn't actually a big interaction or tying between of what the Catholic Church would call Catholic teachings and what is actually included in the system, in the curriculum.
Yeah, well, this one is relatively localized, right? So this one is an Ontario and I think most of Canada issue. BC is different, praise God. But again, it depends on where you go, right? Like I think in the States, they typically will have a system similar to Vancouver, where the schools are actually attached to the parish. So above the principal is the pastor, and then that kind of leads to a little bit more. I won't pretend it's perfect, but a little bit more of a proper, I guess, representation of Catholic teaching. I think it depends on where you are for that particular piece.
I think highlighting the kind of, I don't know if it's the hierarchy is the right word or the leadership is important, because it's kind of the second reason that I kind of come to was that if anyone who's familiar with the way these teachers are hired or brought into the system, it's not really the Catholic school boards going out of their way to, fully vet and thoroughly vet that these teachers are, fully practicing Catholics and regularly attending Sunday Mass and everything, or, being extra involved in ministry or anything. I don't think that's part of the hiring considerations. So
how do you even assess that?
Yeah,
like it's just
sure.
like, how Catholic are you? Like what does that mean, right?
And so I think what we're trying to get at there is also something. This is broader than the whole teacher and Catholic school system conversation, but it's definitely holiness. There's this kind of trickle down effect, right? And this is something that I picked up from our seminarian friend in a talk he gave recently. But he said, if the priest is holy, then the people are fervent.
Yeah.
If the priest is fervent, then the people are pious. If the priest is pious, then the people are good. If the priest is just good, then the people are godless. And so there is this kind of trickle down effect where the person kind of leading the way has a very important role to properly, in this context, filter down things like Catholic teachings, things that we are talking about in terms of Catholic formation, especially for kids that are at such a young age. And when you're leaders, and again, in this context, the teachers, if in the event that they are not kind of regularly practicing Catholics themselves, or have significant doubts about the Catholic faith, that's going to trickle down to what the children are able to pick up and learn. And before we dive more into that, not that we need to, but I do want to caveat that, like, this is just kind of a more general observation in terms of the teachers, who a lot of them who are my friends too, right? Like they teach within the Catholic school system. It's more about kind of the overall mass population of teachers. I know I had a few teachers who were very good Catholics, for example. So I know that that definitely is a thing. So I do want to throw that out there. But otherwise, just in general, like I think that that level of holiness is really important when we're talking about the people leading our informing our children.
Yeah, definitely. I think first of all, full like I love our friend the seminarian, but full credit where it's due. I think that's actually a quote from the book The Soul of the Apostle.
Fair enough.
I believe so. But anyways,
if I read the book, I would be able to quote it properly.
Yeah, honestly, you know what? I don't know how many more hints we can give, right? But, I think at the end of the day, the piece here is that, and I'm trying to find actually a view on or from my notes from a different talk, the different areas of formation that exist. Because at the end of the day, one really important piece of the puzzle here is that formation is not just in knowledge, right? We keep talking about the curriculum, even when we're talking about, in this sense, how are the teachers vetted, right? At the end of the day, even if they knew all the things, right, even if they were biblical scholars, that doesn't equate good childhood formation in the faith, right?
Yeah.
Or doesn't necessarily, actually, it doesn't exclude it either, but doesn't necessitate a good formation, right? So there are different pillars of formation that really we need to be looking here holistically. And you know what, like at the end of the day, that's kind of what we're going to get into here, right? Is, how do we create an environment that's conducive to that holistic formation of a child in a way that is loving of the faith, rather than even, making it overly academic, because that can be a huge issue as well.
Exactly. And I think what you're saying is essentially this formation that we keep alluding to of our children should essentially go hand in hand with what's being taught at school. I think it's not one has to be over and above the other. They are equally important because there are things that you learn in a social environment with different populations around you that will help you to witness Christ in a way that you can't witness just in your own home, right? Just think about all the different people that you meet, the different types of people that you meet. It's just inherent in terms of if you were to just stay at home the entire time, it's a lot harder to kind of pick up those kinds of lessons in a Christian context. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's important to kind of highlight here that, this goes hand in hand. It should be complementary.
Yeah, and I've actually found those pillars that I was looking for. So there are 4 of them are priestly formation. For the rest of us, we kind of look at 3. The 3 are spiritual, intellectual, and human. And it's clear that, when we look at things, again, just to rehash that point, when we look at things from an overly academic standpoint or curriculum standpoint, that's just the intellectual, which is important, but it's only one of the 3 pillars, right? Yeah. So we have human formation, which is basically, how do you live as a good human being? How are you someone who's likable, who has interaction with people in a way that is good? And then spiritual, which is really the formation of the whole thing. How do you grow up with a good relationship with God, right? So these 3 are crucial, really, at the end of the day, to childhood formation in the faith.
I mean, there's an easy example here that actually you came up with when we had quickly discussed this before the episode, so you can dive into it more if you want. But basically, you were just saying, like, you can learn about the sanctity of marriage at school, right? In a Catholic school. I don't even know if that's part of the curriculum, but anyway, you can learn about it. But if it isn't actually lived out by your parents, who you look up to, who you live with and go home to every single day, then there's gonna be that disconnect where you won't actually be able to this concept of a sanctity of marriage within a Catholic context will only remain a concept. Exactly.
And you know what, let's even flip it and look at it from a way where how it can be detrimental. When we say the sanctity of marriage, we're basically saying this idea that marriage is the closest kind of reflection of the Trinitarian love, like love that you find in God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, right? If that's what you're taught in school, and then you go home and you have an abusive father who is, domestic violence, God forbid, or anything that's just not positive.
Hmm.
And now what you've just been told is the pinnacle of our faith on earth is this. You know,
Hmm.
that's all you can compare to. So
Yeah.
like, you know, it's just it's not only does it maybe not connect, it can even be a detriment where it's like, well, that if that's the best you can have to offer, like why would I stay?
It can really create a wound. And, I think the sanctity of marriage is just one example.
Mhm.
But even maybe less obvious examples of just living a virtuous life,
Yeah.
right? There are people who can just show up and, come to mass once a week and say that, they're pious people. But they could really just end up being those preachers on the corners that we hear about in the gospel,
Yeah.
where they're just showing up to let everyone know that they're pious when actually, when you kind of do a more thorough examination of their interior lives or their prayer lives and relationships with God, it's not quite as intimate as we should really be striving for. So, in that sense, to bring it back to what we were talking about, I think there's a thing in school, from my memory, where every month there's a virtue, right? There's a virtue that we try to live out as kids with our fellow students and friends. Try to be humble, for example. But if we go home and let's say my mom or my dad are just more arrogant or very prideful and things like that, it's hard to really internalize that particular concept and that virtue. So
Yeah.
just another example there where it can be in so many different areas, that might not be as obvious.
Yeah. And you know what? I think it's one of the big pieces here as well is to really realize that um, doing this sort of a thing in terms of looking at all of these pillars of human formation or whatever, it's not like there's going to be a criteria list you need to go out and approach it with this, like, you know, you need to tick these boxes per se, but more so like here are some thoughts around how to parent, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, these are different things that are in some sense like tried and true in the Christian tradition, to form people, right? Whether you look at this from the Catholic sense or not. And the reason why I flip it in that way as well is because that also means that this is going to help us to be better parents, period. Not
Yeah.
just better parents to our Catholic children to be part of the Catholic thing necessarily, but just, you know, for example, you bring up the virtue of the month, you know, what a great opportunity to journey with your child and say, hey, what's the
Yeah.
virtue this month? Let's work on it together, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something that shows that, hey, as a parent, this is important to me too. Again, you know, the example we gave earlier, but like, we need to make sure that our lives are reflecting what's being taught in the school. Well, the school says it's important every month. I'll also say it's important every month, and then we grow together. You know, like there's a lot of wins to be had here in terms of building that bond with your children and doing so in a way that's just healthy, pointing towards a good that we all, at the end of the day, can feel it deep in our hearts and recognize. And it's just a good way to I don't know, grow as a parent. I think.
Look at you. You're going to be a wonderful father, aren't you?
Listen, in theory, this is all on paper right now.
When the actual human being comes out, everything's going to flip. So
Exactly, it's just gonna be like, oh, virtue in the month, like figure it out yourself.
yeah. So we've laid out the problem statement, right? Like we've laid out the issue. We've kind of gone through, why we think the issue even exists. And, that's a great transition that you just brought up in terms of how can we be witnesses to Christ for children, right? Whether it's for our own children, but also obviously our family friends' children who, I have family friends, uncles and aunties who I looked up to as a kid, right?
Yeah.
Who I was friendly with, or even people just watching on the street. That's always going to be a thing. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, here's the low hanging fruit, right? It's, bring your children to Sunday school, bring them to, give them opportunities where their catechesis will, it's under the guidance of people who have been properly catechized within the Catholic Church and understand kind of the teachings of the Church and why the Church teaches the things that it does. Things like summer Bible camps, right? Like I know a lot of parishes that run their own Bible camps in the summer. Again, it's kind of a social, fun way of being in a Catholic environment while still kind of learning, Catholic teachings for your kid. And, if I can just share my own personal experience, I think when I was like 13 or 14, I went to a seminary for a young men's retreat. I don't even know if it's young men, young boys retreat or whatever. And it was great. I mean, we had sports. We played sports together. We did things like capture the flag. It was a great time, but we also learned a lot about things like mass every morning, things like going to adoration, which at the time I didn't have the patience for because I didn't really understand the implication of Jesus actually being there in front of me in the Eucharist. But it gave me the exposure of what adoration was. And 14 years later, I really appreciated being introduced to adoration at such an early age. So those are the easy things that we can do, I think.
Yeah, and just to clarify, when we say catechesis, really what we're talking about here is religious education. That's essentially what catechesis means. Learning about what the church teaches or what the church believes, right? That's essentially what catechesis is. Catechesis, catechetics, those are all just kind of derivatives of the same word. But I agree. It's important to surround your children with people who are also pursuing the same thing, right? Sending your kids to Catholic school is a good thing. I don't think either of us are saying that's a bad thing to do, right? You're still putting it forward that this is something that's important, and hopefully you're going to be joined by other parents who are doing that for the same reason, right? So it's still a good thing to do, to be in community with other Catholics, trying to do the good. That's almost like the most Catholic thing there is being in community, pursuing the good, right? I think, the step further that we want to kind of, propose is that you live it out too. And you know what?
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I was lucky enough to be in a session with Chris Stefanik recently, and we kind of briefly touched on this topic.
Sorry, who is Chris Stefanik? For those who don't know.
Sorry, Chris Stefanik. Chris Stefanik is oh my goodness,
a guy.
He's a Catholic speaker. He's an author, a podcaster. He's in videos all through Formed.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm forgetting his website's reallifecatholic.com. So he's a great speaker, great evangelist, a big part of the new evangelization movement that Pope St. John Paul II called for years back now. But so I was lucky enough to be in a conversation with him for a different ministry. And we were talking about this, and in particular, what came up was that, sometimes bringing children on board isn't about catechizing them. As much as we're saying that that's important, it's also about wasting time with them. You've mentioned playing capture the flag. There's no benefit to those leaders who are playing capture the flag with you. And if anything, they were probably just like, man, I need to drink an extra cup of coffee to keep up with these children, But it's important to send messages with actions that, for example, one of that would be, hey, this does nothing for me, but you're important enough that I will waste my time with you, and then you can kind of keep on going and just showing with your actions what's important. And then the question really is the faith important enough that your actions also show that it's important? Or are you just sending your kids to go learn about it somewhere else while you aren't practicing the thing? Like that's the message, It's like, is it important enough that you also do it? And then really the question is, how important is it to you? Right?
That's huge, because I definitely know that, there are parents who just send their kids off to Sunday school and they think that's good enough. But you really need to, I think, internalize that, again, oftentimes your children will look to you as their first examples of how to behave in life, right? What is important to you, will likely become what's important to them in some way or another, right? And going back to what we said earlier, apparently from the soul of the apostolate and not our seminarian friend, how is holiness passed down, right? At the time I had mentioned it, I had brought it up within the context of teachers, but you are also a leader, obviously, within the life of your child. So you need to, I guess, we all need to keep in mind that if we want our children to be holy, we have to be holy too. And so, again, just a few more examples. I brought up virtues earlier. If you are, in a disagreement with your spouse, children always find a way to hear, and they always pick up on that, right? When something is a little off between their parents. If you're showing patience, if you're demonstrating compassion, if you're really demonstrating agape love to your spouse, that's something that your child will pick up, and that's something that your child will be able to realize eventually and connect to the fact that this is the Holy Spirit at work, that this showing of patience and compassion to work with your life partner to come to an agreement despite the disagreement that has been had is really something that is because of your own holiness and your own relationship with Jesus, that you yourself are living out the life of being a Christian, and that's something that they will pick up ultimately.
Yeah, it's it's the in-betweens that matter, right? There was this other great line again from Christopher when he was talking. He said, "The parts of life that aren't worth writing about are the parts the most worth living." Right, and his point there was very much kind of what we have talked about a few times, and kind of the point of this podcast is that you know um, it's the ordinary where you build up your life, right? It's through the ordinary moments, and in the same way you kind of touched upon it. Um, our children are watching more than anyone else.
Yeah.
They're watching more attentively than anyone else. What should I be doing? How should I interact with the people around me, with my loved ones, with my coworkers, with strangers on the street, anyone? It's all of these things. You also mentioned like bystanders might just see you in passing. Right? It's these are the moments that matter, and it's kind of, do I need to be I guess in a sense, do I need to be thinking about the example I'm giving to my children, or am I already living that example?
Yeah. If it's already ingrained within you, you don't need to, it becomes second nature. You don't need to think about it.
Yeah.
It's funny because, some people might reply to this conversation that we're having and be like, well, this is why when I get in a disagreement with my spouse, like we try to have it in hushed voices or whatever. I can tell you as a kid, whenever my parents had a disagreement and they tried to keep it hush hush, I just immediately knew. It was kind of like if they started whispering, I would like, that would just perk my attention even more, kind of thing. And so it's not about, trying to hide it under the rug or anything like that with anything in life, obviously. It's definitely, if you're already living this, if you're already living, again, being patient, being compassionate, or just living a Christ-like life, then you don't need to make that extra effort to try to get around, whenever you're not living like a Christ-like life.
And let's bring a full circle here too. This isn't to say that you're expected to be perfect either.
Yeah.
Part of this whole thing and part of the Christian thing is being okay as well with your shortcomings, recognizing them, and also trying to improve, right? And so, if, let's say for me, most very likely one of my shortcomings is going to be my temper. I know that I can have a temper.
Mm-hmm.
And most likely I will blow up, at my wife in front of my kids at some point. And it's going to be important to me, like for me to, in some ways, let that happen, not hide that from my children, but then also show them what I'm going to do about it after.
Exactly.
Right? It's not that I never blow up. It's that I know that I shouldn't have, and then I'm going to do whatever act it takes to show my wife that, hey, those were, that was my feelings getting ahead of me. I shouldn't have let that happen. Here's how I'm going to make up for it now, and here's how I'm going to be better in the future. So that my children also see, hey, it's okay to have shortcomings, but it's not okay to do nothing about it, like it's little things like this where it's like, you know what, like you're not expected to be perfect. That's not what Jason and I are trying to say here.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you interact with all of it? Like that whole, those pillars of formation apply to us as well, right? You and me too, right, Jason? It's just, how are we growing to be, have a better relationship with God, which hopefully we're doing. How are we going to grow in knowledge of God, and how are we growing as just human beings? It's just not any one of those three things in a vacuum. It's all of those three things in harmony and together.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's a really important, I think, clarification. And it's the idea of we're all broken, and how can we heal with God? And of course, along the same lines, how can we show that to our children our brokenness, and how they can find a way to heal with God as well, right? Kind of another throwaway, like nothing we can really smoothly transition into, but I think very relevant for this conversation is how to have the conversation of sex and theology of the body with your children. I don't think we're going to dive into how to do that today. That's not the point of this episode. More so the fact that I think for many of us, our natural inclination is to try to hold off on having that conversation as long as possible, maybe sometimes too late. Not being comfortable with having that conversation. I think we want to highlight that nowadays more than ever, it is important to have that conversation with your children, but because you want to be able to expose the beauty of sex and the beauty of theology of the body to them in a controlled environment, because you know for a fact that what they watch on TV, what they hear about from their friends, what they hear on their radio or on podcasts or see on their tablets and cell phones is not going to be given to them in kind of the structured way that the Catholic Church would want to kind of disseminate that information, because that's not how the world thinks, right? Yeah. And so having that conversation, it can be difficult. It'll be as awkward as you make it, I guess, is kind of my mentality. And there are so many resources from people like Jason Everett and Christopher West, who are leading Catholic speakers on these particular topics. Matt Fradd as well, particularly on pornography. So these resources exist, and I would just say, get yourself prepared, in advance in terms of mentally, I think, because it's not as awkward as we might think.
Yeah, and you know what? It also doesn't have to be one big conversation, right?
Yes.
Sure. It's important to kind of like this whole thing with what we've been saying here is that no one topic is only one thing, right? And so, this in particular ties back to what we were talking about earlier about do you show the sanctity of marriage in your marriage, right? So if that's there, it also makes it easier to say little things, right? Because part of the issue, I think, with pop culture today with this particular topic is that it also makes sexuality the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It's one of many beautiful things in a marriage. Mm-hmm. So if you live a good marriage and you're able to show your children, hey, media shows a million things. It looks like this is it, right? Where's the nice date?
Yeah.
Let's say I said to my children, like, hey, do you ever notice how happy mom is after I take her on a date? Guess what? That had nothing to do with any of these other things that society says you need to do to please someone. So
exactly.
There's this secret book of secrets in some sense of how to do things that society isn't telling us about. And there's so many different pieces to be had here, right? So my point really is just, let's not blow it up either to be this, the birds and the bees talk that you have to have when your child hits 14 and you just sit down at the dining table and say, son, we need to talk. It doesn't need to be that, because that's intimidating for everyone involved. It can also just be like you're sitting on the couch, some awkward commercial comes on.
Yeah.
Like, hey, that was kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
And just kind of planting the seed, slowly kind of molding their minds and their being really into someone who respects it for what it is.
The more you blow it up, and the more awkward you go about it, I guess, the more it will kind of raise that flag, and you'll have to address that flag within your children's minds. So
yeah, totally.
Yeah. So we've talked about kind of the outside world and secular world, and that influence on I guess the topic of sex and theology of the body, but I think kind of zooming back out to our original topic, how about when children reach university and college, right? Because oftentimes that's when they it's their first time moving away from home, and it's the whole idea of, all the freedom that we receive, and, it's time to party, right? How should we think as, I guess, potential parents, right? 20 years from now, how would we deal with that kind of transition?
So for me, I've actually had a conversation about this with a few different people, and my kind of philosophy here is that, you know what, it's going to happen. Things are going to happen. Life is going to happen. Like, if I just try and shield my children from these kinds of inputs from society, I'm being naive. So I'm really hoping that, through the same thing, through being a part of my children's journey and being super open with them, transparent about my life, and hopefully that being reflected in through my example, that they'll show the same things to me, and that we can just, if it's a small harm, try things together. Just their first sip of alcohol, we can do it together. You want to drink more, see what it feels like. It's not the end of the world at the end of the day, right? So I really think that again, to your point, don't blow this up. It only becomes a flag if you make it a flag. Same thing, as things come up, let's talk about it. And then hopefully that will translate into, again, a respect for my children, that like, hey, if dad says this is a hard no, there's probably a good reason for it, because everything else that a lot of other people say are a hard no, he said, sure, let's try it. So he's clearly cool about things, as long as if I'm curious, but hey, like, there are some lines in life that you can't cross, right?
I happened to see a tweet on my timeline earlier this week. It's from the Babylon Bee. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of a Christian parody humor website. What's the one that, The Onion? It's like The Onion, but for Christians. And the headline is, local Christian parents pay university $100,000 to totally destroy 18 years of their hard work. Which I just thought was funny and relevant for this particular conversation. But I think it's what you talked about in terms of having that natural conversation with your kids, and maybe try it together. And I think it's also going back to what we said previously in terms of the human formation. And thank you for that bit of wisdom there. The human formation of surrounding your child with these kinds of friends and people that they can grow in a Catholic environment in, I suppose. And this is something that you and I can kind of attest to, where the Chinese Catholic community that we were a part of at our university was a huge influence on both of our formation. Now, saying that, it's not like the 100% necessary kind of thing, because my girlfriend went to a university that had a prominent Catholic community, both the CCC and a Newman Center, and she didn't join either of those. But she's a pretty holy person, and she has a pretty good relationship with God, and is very invested in her faith, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not the be all and end all to necessarily surround someone or surround your child with the next CCC, but it definitely helps, right? And to have this kind of support system and people that you trust your child to kind of lean on during what can really be their most formative years, I think is something to try to keep an eye out for.
And you know what? Don't overreact if things happen, right? Like, it's I will say that I feel that life is awkward to navigate now as compared to a lot of times previous, right? And it's only going to get worse in that sense. By the time our children grow up and go to university, like, who knows what the world will look like? I also think part of this is not pretending like you understand everything. One of my pet peeves, just from previous generations, is like, oh, well, like, everything you've gone through, I've gone through. It's like, well, no, you haven't, right? You might have an idea of what's happened. You might be able to draw analogies, but you don't know what I'm going through. So in that same way, if you have analogous experiences, or if you have things that you think are similar to what your child went through, just say like, hey, this is something I experienced. Is that kind of what you're going through? You can definitely do that, but don't pretend to understand what they're going through, because a lot of times it can be condescending and belittling, right? Like, oh, I know what that's like. This is all you need to do. It's like, okay, like, come on, right? Versus, hey, this is something I experienced. Is that similar? Then it seems more like, hey, can I help? And I think that really helped to build that relationship as well, of like, you can always come to me, and if I can help, I will. And if it's something new you need to navigate, we can try and figure something out together. I feel like that's a lot, a healthier place to be. And again, all on paper, right? Like who knows? In practice, it could be, or I would believe that it'd be a lot harder, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to minimize that, but at the same time, there are easy things to avoid, like that saying, "Hey, like, I know exactly what you're going through. This is what you need to do." I think it's an easy thing to avoid.
It's good that you're already aware of these things, right? Like you said, when the actual moments come, it could be a lot tougher to, when you're within the emotion of the moment to do these things. But at least now you already have a path set for yourself,
Yeah.
which is more than maybe some potential parents can say, right? So, but hopefully this episode can kind of open up some minds on that.
Yeah.
And so I think just to kind of tie everything together here, our last few podcast episodes, we've talked about the interior life a few times, and really it's something that's really important to both Andrew and myself to continually develop, to continually focus on. And it's very much relevant to this discussion, right? To this whole discussion of how can we increase our own holiness, and as a result, show it to the children who will be looking up to us for so much of their lives, right?
Yeah, totally. Is it sorry.
Yeah.
Is it Saint Christopher who had the reservoirs? Give me one second.
You would know better than me. I don't even know what you're referring to, man.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so some quote, some saint, I want to say Saint Christopher, but I could easily be wrong. Had a saying where he said, we ought to try and be reservoirs rather than channels, because channels, whatever comes in is immediately gone, right? So almost like a river in a sense, right? If you think of it, there's never any water staying in one place. And so when we think about this in the spiritual life, that's where, grace is just coming in and out, and we never have any for ourselves. What we should become is reservoirs that overflow to the people around us, right? And that's exactly kind of what you're talking about here. For us, it's so important that we grow in the interior life so that we can be holy enough that our spillover can positively influence our children, right? That's kind of what we want to go towards. And as well, this whole concept of the interior life, as much as it may be something that some of you may not have heard of before, it's something we all have, right? By nature of baptism, it's there, and so for our children, and maybe we'll talk about baby baptism at some point, but hopefully we're baptizing our children early, and that means that they have an interior life that needs to be nurtured as well, and whether it's, again, it doesn't need to be an academic thing where you say like, hey, here are the 7 mansions of alcohol. You're probably not going to tell your 5-year-old that, but help walk them through it, right? Just like, hey, let's pray every day. Hey, let's grow, and let's, for us as future parents, let's be reservoirs, so that we can overflow and always have something for ourselves as well, so that we continue to grow in holiness as well.
That's a beautiful way of ending it. I just did a quick Google search. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, apparently.
Completely wrong.
But you got the gist of the quote, right? I was reading it and I was like, yeah, this is exactly what you're talking about. So no, that's a great way to end it. There is an ending to this episode that is not as great, but something I just wanted to kind of call out. There was some recent news in terms back in British Columbia, actually, where 215 bodies, children of indigenous descent is what I'm trying to say. The remains of these 215 children were found on the site of what was once a residential school. And I guess, we just wanted to quickly note that we ask that you would keep them in your prayers, just in terms of, the repose of the souls of these 215 children. But I think just all the indigenous people in general, because the residential schools, the crime of the residential schools, in case you weren't aware, these indigenous people were part of a program to assimilate them into Canadian society. And very much a part of that at the time was forcing them to convert to Christianity. And this obviously is not something that is Christ-like. It's not something that we should stand for as Catholics. And so we pray for healing. We pray for, all indigenous peoples. And we pray for God to show his mercy and kindness. All right. So that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you for listening, and you'll hear from us next time.
Thanks, everyone.